What if you made a wish that came true? But it was a wish made in a moment of frustration. Unable to be courageous enough to admit your true feelings, you instead wish for the ideal outcome. A partner who loves you more than anyone in the whole world. Big mistake. I'm absolutely obsessed with obsession, and I've picked up my own one wish willow, so stay tuned to the end to see what I wish for. So Obsession was written, directed, and edited by Curry Barker, and I found it to be confronting, uncomfortable, scary, and utterly impressive in the way it explores its themes of misogyny, objectification, gender dynamics, and mental illness. The way in which these pervasive attitudes not only manifest in the brutalization and dehumanization of women, but also how it doesn't truly benefit men either, especially if you're interested in a genuine, reciprocal kind of love. So in this video, I'm going to discuss each of the main characters and how they reflect the movie's themes in their actions, as well as key moments, and what considerations they've sparked in me. So whilst I definitely believe this film to be a feminist film quite overtly, and a lot of this video essay is discussing those themes, it's worth noting that it doesn't come across as pandering or spoon-fed. And I think this is because of how Curry Barker set out to write the script.
You write a story and then you figure out the message after you have written it, and then you go back and you're like, oh, okay, this is kind of what this is saying. And then you can kind of sprinkle in the message a little bit more.
If you try to fit a plot around a message, that's always going to come across as a bit contrived. But writing, like Curry Barker has, what excites you most, and then noting the inherent themes that emerge, and then choosing to shine a light on those by sprinkling some more of that in, makes the film feel really organic. And I don't mean that to sound, I don't know, pandering myself, because this film is extremely successful because it's just that good. It's just well made, it's well edited, it's well directed, it's well written, and it's feminist as fuck, and I think that's awesome. Before we get into the analysis, I'm just going to do a quick synopsis of the entire film. If you'd rather just jump right in, here is the timecode to get to the analysis. Bear is struggling to find the confidence and the right words to express his crush for his longtime friend Nikki. After failing to admit his feelings at a perfectly opportune time, he instead makes a wish that she would love him more than anyone in the world. This causes Nikki to become obsessed with Bear and exhibit increasingly disturbing behavior. For a while, Bear tries to rationalize this behavior away and maintain his dream relationship, even after it becomes clear that the real Nikki has been completely subjugated and is trapped inside a horrific nightmare without bodily autonomy. His friends Ian and Sarah become wrapped up in the fallout of this toxic relationship and ultimately die at the hands of obsessed Nikki as a result of Bear's actions. When Bear finally tries to do the right thing and take himself out of the equation so Nikki can be saved, he instead chickens out and attempts to throw up the pills. Before he can, obsessed Nikki makes her own wish, causing him to reflect back to her this mutual obsession. Bear overdoses on Nikki's lap, breaking the spell, and the real Nikki is back in her body, surrounded by all of her dead friends. Ian is Bear's best friend and the main person Bear turns to for advice throughout the film. Whilst Bear is awkward, hesitant, and deeply self-conscious, Ian is the complete opposite. He's charismatic, confident, and socially dominant. And because of this, Bear instinctively treats him like someone who understands women better than he does. But what Bear fails to recognize is how casually dismissive Ian is towards women from the very beginning. We see this clearly in the opening diner scene. Bear is rehearsing a speech he wants to give Nikki to confess his feelings. He's vulnerable, sincere, and the waitress, who acts as his test subject, actually seems genuinely touched by what he's saying. She begins to offer her thoughts, but Ian immediately interrupts, talks over the woman, and ridicules the entire thing. He frames Bear's honesty as embarrassing and overly emotional, pushing him away from vulnerability and towards performance instead, adding to his confusion on the best path forward. I found the way Ian dismisses the waitress particularly interesting. Rather than directly asking her to leave, he simply says, "Thank you," in a pointed way that forces her to interpret his passive-aggressive intention. She awkwardly asks, "You want me to leave?" And Ian replies, "If you want to." This reframes Ian's own will as though it were her choice. It's notable that Bear doesn't call out this rudeness. Instead, he internalizes the embarrassment and apologizes for making her listen to the speech in the first place. To me, this feels reflective of how women are often excluded from conversations that directly affect women, or briefly consulted before being talked over so the boys can get down to the real discussion. On that point, there's a very interesting visual detail that I noticed. After the waitress leaves and Ian sits opposite Bear, there's a group of men visible in the background, and the way they are sat makes it look very similar to a podcast setup. I can't say for sure that it was intentional, but it immediately made me think of the endless ecosystem of podcast bro relationship advice online. Ian's worldview feels pulled from that space. The confidence, the performative detachment, the insistence that women respond to games rather than honesty or vulnerability. What makes this even more manipulative is that Ian is withholding crucial information from Bear the entire time. He's secretly been sleeping with Nikki for years, something that would completely change the way Bear interprets both her behavior and Ian's advice. Yet Ian still positions himself as the authority figure, dispensing wisdom whilst hiding his own personal stake in the situation. Even his repeated advice that Bear has nothing but time feels less like genuine guidance and more like self-preservation of his casual fling with Nikki. He wants his cake and he wants to eat it too. And whilst you might think Ian has somehow won these games by successfully sleeping with Nikki, I don't think the film presents it that way. Their relationship appears relatively casual and certainly not the kind of deep emotional connection Bear believes he's pursuing. And we also see how Ian's advice doesn't really work for Bear. He even calls Nikki a nickname which Ian suggested, which is Freaky Nikki. But this is a sensitive topic for Nikki and it only pushes her away. When the whole group of friends are at their trivia night, Bear repeatedly tries to find a moment alone with Nikki, only for Ian to derail or redirect the interaction. Regardless of whether Ian's motivation is to try and spare Bear embarrassment or only acting out of self-interest, he definitely derailed opportunities for Bear to be genuine and honest. One can't help but wonder if Ian hadn't gotten in his friend's head or kept interrupting him, maybe Bear would have been able to avoid the horrific wish scenario. Even if he were likely to be rejected by Nikki, at least he could have moved on and maybe ultimately ended up starting something more genuine with Sarah, but we'll get into Sarah next. After the wish, Ian does at least seem more willing than Bear to acknowledge that something is seriously wrong with Nikki. He questions Bear's motivations several times and even asks whether he's taking advantage of her. But despite recognizing the situation as disturbing, he still never fully intervenes. Nikki's suffering continues to be framed primarily through how uncomfortable or inconvenient it is for the people around her. Even when Ian questions Bear, he ultimately still sides with him socially, inviting Bear to the party whilst excluding Nikki as though she is the problem. Later, towards the climax of the film, when Bear arrives at Ian's house covered in blood and ranting about the One Wish Willow, Ian initially asks if Nikki is okay, correctly worrying that his friend, who is covered in blood, might have harmed her. But he abandons that concern almost immediately, whilst he finally agrees to make a wish. Rather than even attempting to assuage Bear's distress by going along with what he wants, Ian immediately wishes for $1 billion. That moment reveals where Ian's priorities ultimately lie. Faced with the possibility to help someone suffering, his first instinct is self-interest, and afterwards he becomes completely consumed by the fantasy of wealth. He then shows up at Bear's house not to check in on his clearly distressed friends, but to excitedly discuss how they should spend the money. It mirrors the way many misogynistic influencers online profit from harmful rhetoric, whilst remaining emotionally detached from the real-world consequences of the ideas they spread. And I think the film gives Ian a really fitting end. Early on, he dismisses and talks over a woman, but in his final moments, he becomes the one who is abruptly silenced. His voice literally cut off mid-sentence by Nikki. Even more fittingly, the only reason Nikki has access to the gun in the first place is because Ian himself told her about it earlier in the film. In a sense, his own words created the conditions for his downfall. Sarah. Sarah is one of the more interesting characters in the film because though she is herself a woman, she still contributes to Nikki's ongoing suffering. So Sarah and Bear are close friends, and it's heavily implied throughout the film that she has feelings for him. Nikki even jokes early on that Sarah is so obvious about her crush, which is interesting because it reinforces this idea planted in Bear's mind from the beginning that honesty and obviousness are somehow embarrassing or undesirable. Sarah also has her own emotional frustrations outside of Bear. She's trying to get into art school and has faced repeated rejection after rejection, with only one final application left to hear back from. So there's already this underlying feeling of disappointment and longing surrounding her character. She wants something deeply just like Bear does. And because of this, I think Sarah begins interpreting Nikki almost entirely through the lens of how Nikki affects Bear, rather than through concern for Nikki herself. Once Nikki starts behaving strangely, Sarah very quickly positions Bear as the victim of the situation. Nikki becomes the problem, the unstable girlfriend, and the burden. And while some of Nikki's behavior is undeniably frightening and erratic, what disturbed me is how little empathy Sarah ultimately shows towards the possibility that Nikki is genuinely suffering. The party scene is probably the clearest example of Sarah's misguided understanding of the situation. Everyone is gathered around playing a game involving wooden blocks with dares written on them. Through a seat swap, Bear ends up sitting next to Sarah, and then pulls the dare telling him to kiss the person on his left. There's this brief moment where Sarah seems excited by the possibility, but the mood immediately shifts when Nikki abruptly stands up and walks around to stand behind Sarah's chair, clearly unhappy about the dare and wanting to switch places with Sarah. Now, obviously Nikki's behavior here is socially unsettling and uncomfortable, but what I found interesting is that Sarah seems to understand exactly what's happening and yet makes no effort to diffuse the situation. She stays seated even as the tension escalates, forcing Nikki into the humiliating position of physically dragging the chair backwards. And there's something deeply uncomfortable about the way everyone at the party watches Nikki unravel publicly, while Sarah quietly benefits from it. Nikki's distress becomes evidence that Sarah is the more stable, desirable option. And Bear, of course, does absolutely nothing. He allows Nikki to absorb the social humiliation whilst remaining completely passive, which is of course a recurring pattern throughout the film. Sarah thinks she knows Bear well enough to believe that he is a wholly good person, yet she has never been in a truly intimate relationship with him. Thus, she has no access or understanding of what he is like in a relationship. Later, during the car scene, Sarah frames her concern for Bear as wanting to help him escape an unhealthy relationship. She tells him Nikki needs serious mental health support and shouldn't be relying entirely on him. And to an extent, she's right. But the conversation gradually starts to feel less like concern for Nikki and more like emotional positioning. Sarah is comforting Bear, validating Bear, pulling closer to Bear, and eventually she attempts to kiss him, despite her full awareness that he's still in a relationship. That's what makes Sarah a particularly compelling and uncomfortable character to me. She isn't an evil manipulator, and her feelings are understandable. Most people probably have experienced jealousy or attraction towards someone unavailable, but the film shows how easily empathy can erode once our own desires become emotionally involved. Sarah recognizes Nikki's suffering, but she still prioritizes her own closeness to Bear over Nikki's humanity. Whilst, of course, the majority of the blame should be on Bear if he were to cheat, I found it incredibly gross that Sarah was willing to initiate this cheating. And so I found my own reaction to this sequence particularly revealing. As the tension in the car scene builds, the audience knows something is about to happen to Sarah. This is a horror film after all. And disturbingly, part of me wanted that. I found myself wanting her to be punished for siding with Bear, for dismissing Nikki, for trying to insert herself into this toxic situation. But then the violence actually happens. And the brutality of Sarah's death completely shattered that emotional satisfaction. Watching her repeatedly smashed against the brick was genuinely horrific and excessive, forcing me as an audience member to confront the ugliness of the desire for punishment itself. The film takes the mundane, petty emotional logic of jealousy and rivalry and pushes it into something grotesque and irreversible. It is also notable that Sarah's death involves the brick, considering the earlier party game revolves around wooden bricks that initiate the almost kiss between her and Bear. It creates this subtle symbolic echo between flirtation, humiliation, and violence. And then comes one of the film's most tragic details. After Sarah dies, Bear opens her letter and discovers she had finally been accepted into art school. Suddenly, she stops being just part of this toxic romantic dynamic and is recontextualized as a full person with a future, ambitions, and a life beyond Bear entirely. All of that is destroyed because of the choices made by a cowardly man too afraid to face rejection honestly. It's also only after Sarah's death that Bear finally becomes proactive and seriously attempts to reverse the wish. Nikki even directly tells him, "This is what you wanted. This is what you wished for." In a different world where Bear was just honest with Nikki, then he could have moved on from the rejection and perhaps started something genuine with Sarah. But of course, he was too cowardly for that. And though Sarah's death marks the end of her personhood, it tragically isn't the end of what happens to her body. During the film's climax, obsessed Nikki appears wearing Sarah's clothes and even her scalped hair like a wig. She also smashes her own face with a brick, attempting to make herself into the person that Bear now seems to desire over her. Before getting into Nikki and Bear more directly, I want to take a moment to talk about the film's recurring use of the profane. What made me first think about this was the exact wording of Bear's wish. He doesn't simply say, "I wish Nikki loved me more than anyone in the world." He says, "anyone in the fucking world." And I think the use of profanity in his wish adds this other element. The wish itself already contains something excessive and unhealthy. Bear doesn't wish to be understood or genuinely chosen by Nikki. He wishes to become the absolute center of her existence, and the profanity amplifies and distorts that obsession. Fucking is such an interesting word because it's emotionally loaded but incredibly imprecise. It's a very human word in the sense that its meaning depends entirely on emotional nuance and social context. The obsessed Nikki seems to struggle to understand and embody what Bear meant by this word. The world to obsessed Nikki isn't simply the world, it's the fucking world. Her confusion over this word is evident the morning after she first stays at Bear's house. When Bear wakes up to find his dead cat arranged in a makeshift memorial surrounded by scattered trash, he reacts by saying it is fucked up. But Nikki asks him if that's a good thing. It's unsettling because it reveals how disconnected she's become from ordinary human emotional understanding. Then later we have the moment where Nikki stands in one place for dozens of hours staring at the door with a smile, waiting for Bear to return home. Her obsession has consumed her to the point of literally peeing, vomiting, and shitting all over herself because any care or love she has been absorbed by Bear. She doesn't clean herself up out of self-care, but because she intuits that Bear wants her to do so. When he looks over to see the pile of excrement on the carpet, I couldn't help but remember what the shopkeeper said at the start of the film. When she was describing the crystal necklaces to Bear, she refers to one of them as representing love and shit. And in this moment, we see literal shit because of Bear's wish for love. At the end of the film, Bear returns home to find Sarah's desecrated corpse displayed near a grotesque shrine dedicated to Bear and Nikki's relationship. The scene resembles an altar, something sacred and devotional, but it's contaminated by trash, moisturizer bottles, and random objects. The film repeatedly takes the imagery of romance, intimacy, and worship and corrupts it with something ugly and excessive. When Nikki is screaming at Bear with a gun to her chin, it is notable that she's screaming incoherent and extremely vulgar profanities. The scene feels spiritually grotesque and reminded me of the possessed girl in The Exorcist. Bear's unfortunately worded wish has been embodied completely. The love he hoped for has curdled into something demonic, because love without freedom, individuality, or mutual humanity doesn't become romance, it becomes desecration. So now I'm going to discuss Nikki and Bear together as their characters are entwined for the majority of the film. I personally believe that Nikki's obsession isn't a bubbling up and exaggeration of original Nikki's feelings, but rather the embodied reflection of Bear's own obsession. It's interesting that the lead character's name is Bear, considering the viral internet question asking women whether they'd rather be alone in the woods with a bear or a man. Curry Barker, however, has said this connection wasn't intentional, but it's still a pretty fascinating coincidence nonetheless. So the film opens with Bear rehearsing the perfect speech to confess his feelings to Nikki. He seems utterly infatuated with her to the point of obsession. He stalks her social media, lights up every time she calls, and admires her almost like an ideal rather than a person. And though Bear could be perceived as somewhat sympathetic, perhaps a hapless romantic at the beginning, it's also shown that he is a neglectful pet owner, and his lack of proactively hiding harmful medication led to the death of his cat. And at the end of the day, the tragic outcome is the same, regardless of the cat's death being caused by passivity rather than deliberate malice. When Nikki accidentally loses her crystal necklace down the drain, Bear immediately sees this as an opportunity to be the one to replace that loss. Not with another crystal necklace which Bear decides on her behalf she would hate, but rather with a one-wish willow. When he takes the willow to the cashier, she asks, "What, no crystal?" And Bear replies, "I like this." Not, "I think she'd like this." I like this. And I think this further relates to how obsessed Nikki reflects Bear's I and not her own. Even his gift, meant to be thoughtful, is ultimately an extension of his own desires rather than an understanding of hers. He's, consciously or not, trying to position himself within her life in the way he wants. Because at this point, Bear is obsessed with Nikki's ideal and the fantasy that exists in Bear's head. He thinks she's perfect, and more importantly, perfect for him. It's notable that even before the wish, we never see Nikki relating to others without Bear's presence, so we are not getting a full character portrait of Nikki ever, and that's kind of the point. So before the wish, through Bear's eyes, Nikki seems genuinely warm, playful, and generous. Part of what attracts Bear to her is actually her kindness towards other people. She refuses to let him pay for drinks and even borrows money from Sarah to give to a homeless man. Bear admires these qualities in her, but the tragedy is his wish gradually strips them away. Obsessed Nikki no longer has her own inner life, desires, or priorities. Everything becomes consumed by Bear. And although Bear initially enjoys this complete devotion, the relationship montage reveals that he quickly becomes slightly exhausted by the singular attention. What we see is Bear getting what he thinks he wanted, his fantasy ideal woman completely obsessed with him. Yet he loses all that he would have or should have actually wanted, which is a deeper understanding of who Nikki truly is, her full person, not just the parts of her that Bear finds initially appealing. It's notable that in this scene where Bear is dropping Nikki home and before he makes his wish, she talks about the novel she's writing being a love story and not a romance, but Bear doesn't really understand the difference. She then says that she feels Bear is the only one that she can talk to about this stuff. Yet I got the sense that their interaction was still somewhat shallow, and I felt bad for Nikki that this is deep to her. Nikki doesn't seem close with her family, and we see in the film how her so-called friends aren't actually good friends to her either. She seems like a young woman uncertain about her future, wanting to make a change to figure out what she really wants out of life. And though she tells Bear she feels he is the only one she can have these kinds of conversations with, it's soon revealed how little he really cares about these more uncomfortable aspects. After the wish, when obsessed Nikki gets in Bear's car, a tactic she uses to be able to stay with him is to cry about her supposed dying father. Though Bear is confused by this because she'd previously said she's not close with her father, she still appears to be in emotional distress. And Bear's reaction is rather telling. He practically rolls his eyes. Perhaps he also senses the performative aspect of the crying, but it still seems like as soon as he has to engage with her in a way that makes him feel put upon or doesn't also benefit him, he finds it exhausting. Later, during the restaurant scene, Nikki gives Bear a crystal that her mother had given to her. The gesture feels deeply personal and symbolic, but something about Bear receiving it feels wrong and invasive. It feels like an inheritance of womanhood and identity being redirected towards a man who still hasn't truly seen her as a full person. It's also reflective of the original gift meant to be a crystal necklace, and this moment further illuminates how shallow their prior relationship really was. And Nikki herself even points this out indirectly. She asks Bear what he wants out of life, what job he wants to do, and admits she's never really asked him before. But Bear brushes it off by saying he's just a private person. So he's never truly made himself vulnerable enough for Nikki to know him deeply either. The intimacy that might have allowed genuine mutual love to develop has been completely bypassed in favor of artificial possession. The turning point of the film comes shortly after Ian reveals that Nikki lied about her father being sick. When Bear confronts her, Nikki asks him why the lie matters if she loves him more than anything else. And disturbingly, Bear decides it doesn't matter. The film immediately cuts to Bear using Nikki's body for sex, and the scene is horrifying. She has been completely subjugated and reduced to an object of pleasure. Nikki's blank stare, the disconnected body language, and the fake moaning makes it all feel profoundly empty and violating. Bear isn't checking in with her emotionally because at this point her humanity has become secondary to what she provides him physically. He no longer cares whether her father is ill, whether she's mentally collapsing, or whether any of this relationship is real. What matters is that he gets to experience complete access to his dream girl. And yes, I do think the film is portraying this as assault. So I've been rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer lately, and by coincidence, I watched the episode Dead Things immediately after watching Obsession, and the two stories actually have quite a lot in common. In Dead Things, a trio of nerdy wannabe supervillains create a device that can effectively turn any woman into their brainwashed sex slave. Warren decides to use it on his ex-girlfriend Katrina, who wants absolutely nothing to do with him.
I love you, Master.
But just before her body is violated, she breaks free of the mind control. Much like Nikki's moments of lucidity throughout Obsession, Katrina suddenly becomes aware of what's happening and is horrified. She immediately calls the boys out for what they are, sadistic creeps. Although she uses the R word, unfortunately on YouTube I can't use that, but that word is a strong word for a reason. It's what the trio were trying to do to her, and it's what Bear did to Nikki. Big R word. Big R. What struck me watching the episode was how genuinely surprised they seemed by her reaction. Not because they suddenly felt remorseful, but because they're finally being forced to confront the reality of what they've done from her perspective. They knew it was wrong on some level, otherwise they wouldn't have hidden it, but they had never fully engaged with the horror of it. In their minds, their own desires mattered more than Katrina's autonomy. Their resentment and feelings of entitlement had become so central that her feelings or personhood did not matter. At first glance, Bear seems different. Unlike Warren, he doesn't appear motivated primarily by sexual gratification. He believes he wants true love. He believes he's a hopeless romantic. But as the film progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that Bear feels just as entitled as the trio to live out his fantasy, even at the expense of Nikki's bodily autonomy and humanity. What's a little depressing is that Dead Things aired in 2002, nearly 25 years before Obsession, and yet both stories still feel painfully relevant. And though we've made some progression, these anxieties have never been fully resolved. We're still telling stories about entitlement, control, objectification, because we're still grappling with them. The details change, but the underlying fear remains remarkably familiar. Because the horror of Nikki's situation isn't just that she's forced to love someone she otherwise wouldn't, the deeper horror is the complete destruction of her bodily autonomy and personhood. She loses the ability to make choices, express her own desires, and exist outside of Bear's fantasy. Whenever fragments of the original Nikki briefly resurface, she seems horrified by what's happening. During their first kiss, she momentarily snaps out of the obsession and physically recoils. Later in the film, when Bear sneaks out of bed to meet Sarah, original Nikki tells Bear that the obsessive version of herself is asleep, and she begs him to kill her. And Bear's response to this moment is perhaps one of the most revealing in the entire film. Instead of staying with the real Nikki, listening to her, or working together to fix the situation, he leaves her crying so he can go meet Sarah. It's also notable how different the original Nikki and Bear are in regards to ethics. Whilst Bear is passive and self-serving to the detriment of others, Nikki would rather die than continue to hurt those around her. Her body is being used in every possible horrific way that goes against her values. I also noticed that as Nikki's behavior escalates during the film, Bear increasingly starts treating her less like a partner and more like a misbehaving child. After she feeds him his own dead cat in a sandwich and behaves in ways that are clearly beyond ordinary mental illness, Bear still focuses primarily on controlling and managing her behavior rather than helping her. There's something deeply paternalistic about the way he speaks to her, almost like he's trying to discipline her into becoming socially acceptable again. Even when Bear finally contacts the One Wish Willow hotline and learns the horrifying truth, his first instinct still isn't to cancel the wish, it's to modify it. And when he's told that is impossible, he desperately asks whether Nikki's love is real. The response he receives is chilling. Just because you chose it for her doesn't make it any less real. And this leads him to want to cancel the wish entirely. But the only way to do that is for him to die. But of course, Bear decides to continue and try and preserve some version of the fantasy. He still takes Nikki to the party, he still tries to make the situation manageable instead of confronting its reality fully. At the party, one of the guests jokingly says that Bear must have put a spell on Nikki, and everyone laughs. But Nikki laughs just slightly too hard, almost as though even the obsessed Nikki understands the horrifying truth beneath the joke. Then, when Nikki reads aloud from her writing during the Jenga game, the story is disturbing and grotesque, but also strangely beautiful. You get the sense that Nikki is genuinely talented, deeply creative, and emotionally expressive, but all of that has now been consumed and redirected entirely towards Bear. By the end, after Sarah's brutal death finally forces Bear into action, he at last recognizes that even friendship with the real Nikki would have been infinitely more meaningful than this nightmare version of love. At least friendship would have been her choice. At least he would have been interacting with a real human being instead of a reflection of his own desires. But by then, it's too late. Ian is of course no help, as he's always been self-interested, and even Bear is unable to take the necessary step to end Nikki's suffering. It is only because obsessed Nikki makes her own wish that Bear's throwing up of the pills is interrupted. Even at the end, he never took full accountability. So I just wanted to take a quick moment to discuss the spiritual shopkeepers, how at the beginning it's a woman and towards the end it's a man who claims to have already used his wish. I've seen various theories about this change, including that it might represent the same character wishing to be a man. However, in the screenplay, the first shopkeeper is written as a 29-year-old woman and the later shopkeeper appears as a 34-year-old man. So these details make it unlikely that this is the same person, unless they randomly also wish to be older. A reading I find more compelling is that this shift reflects a gradual withdrawal of meaningful female presence from Bear's world as the consequences of his actions escalate. It's notable that Bear lives in a house inherited from his grandmother, still filled with all her belongings, suggesting a kind of passive inheritance of female labor and stability. At the beginning of the film, the waitress and the shopkeeper both attempt to provide moments of grounding clarity, even if Bear doesn't fully recognize it. Sarah also represents a form of emotional attentiveness and care, even when her own feelings complicate things. So when Bear reaches his most desperate point later in the film, it's striking that these female figures are no longer meaningfully available to him in the same way. What remains is a shrinking social world in which he is left only with male perspectives that are increasingly unhelpful and self-serving. The absence of women after Sarah's death feels like a structural consequence of how the film tracks his moral and emotional collapse. The final sequence feels almost like a corrupted version of Romeo and Juliet. Bear overdoses while obsessed Nikki prepares to end herself alongside with him. But unlike Juliet, when Nikki finally regains her bodily autonomy, she immediately pushes Bear's body away from her, discarding him like the trash he is, not with Bear's suffering, but with hers. So those have been my thoughts on Obsession. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. Before we get to my wish, consider a like, a subscribe, or a hype, and comment below your own insights and thoughts, or check out my Patreon for exclusive perks. But yeah, let's give it a go. I wish I was the most successful YouTuber in the world.
I just stranded these 100 people in the middle of the